You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to a chilly CrimsonCast studios. As we're back for another episode of the show, Scott and Galen joining you once again. Scott, I don't know how it's been up in the Napa Valley of Indiana here lately, but it has been cold and there's been sickness everywhere. It has not been a particularly great middle of February. How are things with you all?
Well, the dome over Carmel and Westfield is great. It's keeping us at a nice biodome of 84 degrees. The vineyards are doing great. No, it's freezing up here too. It's like 8 degrees. It sucks. It's cold. My house is having a hard time keeping up. But people have national holidays. Like people love, certain things. Today is a great day, Gail, and you're catching me at like the apex of my life. I've never had huge bad experiences, but just not fan of going to the dentist.
I hate going to the dentist.
So I went this morning. And I always joke, like, this is now the best time of my life because it's the longest amount of time before I have to go to the dentist. Like, tomorrow is one day closer to my next dentist visit. Like, this is the apex of longest time to dentistry. So I had a great dentist visit, no cavities. We're doing great. So it's like I got 6.5 more months. It'll be August. We'll be into football season at my next dentist appointment. We'll have an IU coach. Like, this is so much time ahead of me.
This is a really good point, actually, Scott, and I'm not kidding. Like, I've thought about this often. Like, I can't think of a required thing that people like less than going to the dentist.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's, like, if the dental industry, like, is there a... And look, to be clear, like, you and I grew up in the 80s. Going to the dentist then was much, much worse. Like, the polish they would put in on the teeth always was like gritty and tasted like crap. And
when I had to get a retainer, like the mold, it's like it just went back into your neck, and it's like you're gonna throw up. It's just throw up over there was kind of there. There wasn't like a let's do it without you yakking. Like we're gonna just yak over there when this putty starts to go down your throat.
It just with all of the improvements, and there have been acknowledged improvements in the dental industry over the last 35, 40 years, they could do more. Like, I don't know how or what. And I don't know if they need to get like a trade organization together to think through like
brand.
But it's also one of those things. It's kind of like
we're open for sponsorships. Dental industry, come to CrimsonCast.
But it's also like you don't have to because everybody needs to go to the dentist. Like, you either go for preventative care or you go for replacement care, like one or the other. It's kind of like funeral homes. Like nobody cares about advertising in the funeral home industry because, I mean, you got to use it. There's not really an option.
Like in the 80s, you had the TV with the VCR. Let's just put them both together, like a dentistry funeral home. Like just make it, and it could be the DMV. Just 3 places you hate going. Like
just exploring new commercial opportunities. That's what we do here at CrimsonCast.
Yeah, I'm picking out my casket, getting my license renewed, and getting the filling taken care of all in one spot.
Might as well sync it all up. That's my, let's stop wasting time. Anyway,
and there's a Fazoli's there. It's just
a Fazoli's.
I'm throwing shade at some bad fast food joint.
That's not the right one. Yeah. It's funny. There's still an active Fazoli's at College Mall, which is wild. And every time we drive by it, my 7-year-old says, "Daddy, is that the place with the yucky pasta?" We've never taken her to Fazoli's, like never once, but apparently just, we've talked enough about Fazoli's just in passing that is filtered through to her. So I think
we're so off track, but when we were in Ohio like 3 years ago, we drove by an active Rax. And if you grew up in the Midwest and know,
I really miss Rax. I'm sorry, I miss Rax. I was
like, we were going. I was like, I want to go. I was like, we were on vacation. I'm like, I really want to go to Rax. I thought it would have ruined our night, but that was like, I love the single last like remaining of those kinds of places.
Like somewhere in America, there's still a Bennigan's open.
Yeah.
Which I think actually Bob and Mike mentioned on the most recent episode of X's and Joe's. So anyway, we are brought to you not by the dentist, not by funeral homes, not by Rax or Fazoli's, or Bennigan's. We are brought to you by Home Field Apparel, which is in no danger of going out of business because they keep sending awesome stuff out to everybody. Go to, of course, you all, I think, ordered the Lee Corso 70s sweater. It is tremendous. It is
funny. They sent out a like customer survey, and one of the questions is like here's some examples. Like they had that Corso sweater of things we came out with. What else would you want? I'm just like, You already blew my mind. Like you did it. Like you won. You're at 100%. Stop gloating.
Yeah, it's like we clearly can't come up with ideas as good as Home Field comes up with ideas, and yet they keep doing it. First the what?
A Rax hoodie.
Rax hoodie. Actually, yes. That's actually what Home Field needs to go with next is a series of designer hoodies for now defunct restaurants.
Like Eastern Airlines, just all defunct brands.
I'm thinking like maybe like a sirloin stockade bomber jacket. Something along those lines.
The Rax, the hockey sweater with the
hockey
on it. Yeah,
sweater for Rax, and maybe get like a Bennigan's pennant that they sell. I think there's some possibilities.
This is gold. This is gold. Yeah. Stop right now. Stop. Yeah.
You can just thank us later.
Rax.
Anyway, though, what they really do sell is college apparel of all types and varieties, not just IU apparel, but T-shirts and 3/4 sleeve tees and crew necks and hoodies, just the whole kit and caboodle. Use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order at Home Field Apparel. Go do it now. You'll thank us later. You might thank us now while you're listening, but you can thank us later as well. And we look forward to seeing what else they're coming out with as the tournament is approaching, and this is one of their 2 big periods of the year, along with the launch of the college football season. Also, just a reminder, we are on YouTube. If you'd like to watch us talk, go to the Back Home Network YouTube channel. Just search Back Home Network on YouTube. Join the over 7,000 people that have subscribed. We're also on Substack, CrimsonCast.substack.com. Check us out there. You can subscribe for free, get newsletters delivered right to your inbox with our podcasts, occasionally some VIP materials. And there's also a paid option with the VIP materials if you'd like to financially support the show. Anyway, Scott, we have a finite amount of time today, but we wanted to start diving into some of these individual candidates that we've heard floated. It's been a remarkably quiet week so far in terms of the coaching search, which I think is a good thing. We don't want wild rumors and innuendo flying around. We had enough of that the first week with the Brad Stevens nonsense.
Don't want to the Knicks.
Right. Correct. Yeah. So we're just kind of at this point dialing it back, settling in. And as we've talked about many times with people, this is going to be a long process. Today, we're recording this on Thursday, February 20th. And I'd like to note that the NCAA tournament doesn't even start effectively until the 20th of March. You got play-in games the first 2 days there, but we're a month away from the tournament starting. Unless IU is going to hire someone who A, doesn't make the tournament, or B, isn't coaching in college, we're still not going to know anything definitive a month from now.
Right.
So we need to turn the burners down to a simmer, which I think a lot of people have done. I give them credit. But it's time to start talking about some of these candidates more in depth. So we wanted to pick 3, maybe 4, depending on time, talk through pros, cons, perceptions, what they've done in coaching. And we kind of picked some names at random. By we, I mean me. And I sent them to Scott. And I was like, hey, research these. But we're going to go through 4 candidates, talk through what they do, how they approach the game. And we're not even going to talk about necessarily their press appearances. We might with a couple of them, but it's really like, what do the numbers show? So we're going to launch right into that. And we're not going to endorse anybody, but we will give some opinions, obviously, on how we think this would work or not work with each of these candidates.
And I just want to say, having done the research, this is going to be the slow tempo group.
Yes.
Putting them together as we started going through the names, I'm like, oh, slow tempo. Like, oh, slow tempo. Like, oh, Galen's sending me. It's a group. So as Bill Simmons would put people in, category. This is the slow tempo coaches.
This is the slow tempo group. It was not on purpose, but it just kind of happened that way. So let's start off with a name that's been in the news lately and has been debated already quite a bit. Has been, I don't want to say pushed necessarily by certain people, but it kind of feels like he's getting pushed by certain people. But let's start with Mick Cronin. Mick Cronin is, of course, currently the head coach at UCLA. And, I think it's important that we understand a little bit of Mick Cronin's history. This is actually Mick Cronin's 6th season right now at UCLA. And for those of you who are watching along, either on YouTube or on Spotify, I'm going to call up Cronin's KenPom page, which is kind of behind the paywall. But I wanted to walk everybody through like what's been accomplished so far and what his background is. Now, first, before we get to that, I wanted to rattle off just some facts and figures about Mick Cronin so that everybody's on the same page. So Mick Cronin right now has, for the course of his career, a .684 win percentage, which is a pretty good win percentage, you got to say. That is a win percentage that I think most people would be pretty pleased to have. He's currently 53 years old, which is younger than I think a lot of people might anticipate him being. He'll be 54 at the start of the 2025-2026 basketball season. For the course of his career, he's 15-14 in the NCAA tournament. He has one Final Four, which was in 2021, which I'll get to in a minute. He made 2 additional Sweet 16s while he's been at UCLA. He was at Cincinnati prior, and in 13 years at Cincinnati, he made a ton of tournaments, only made 1 Sweet 16. That happened in the 2011-2012 season. Only had, I think, 4 seasons at Cincinnati where he lost fewer than double-digit games in a given year. So that's kind of like the basic facts and figures of Mick Cronin. And I'm going to go ahead and call up the screen here that has his KenPom page so we can all follow along. It's a little tiny here, so I'm going to try to zoom in a little bit. There you go. So if you look at Mick Cronin, one of the things to note about these KenPom pages, if you've never looked at them from, on the back end, is that Ken does a great job of color coding categories based upon what is good or bad. And in most cases, like the continuum is for things that if blue is generally slow and orange is fast. And then you've got a separate set of categories where green is good or high in the ranking and red is low in the ranking. And you mentioned this right off the bat, so I want to go ahead and get to it right away. Mick Cronin really prefers to play slow. If you look at the history of the teams he's had one team in his entire coaching history that was in the top 200 of tempo in any given year. And it was his first year at Murray State, which was a good year. They went to the NCAA tournament. They were a 12 seed. They were 28-6 overall. They were 59th in the country in tempo. That was in 2004. Basically, ever since then, he has slowed the tempo way, way down. And that was very much the case at the tail end of his time at Cincinnati, where they rarely got above 64 possessions per game. They had one year where they were at 59.8 possessions per game, which is like Benettian. I don't know what the proper phraseology there would be. At UCLA, he's done the same thing. Last year's UCLA team was 353rd in tempo. This year's team is 313th. I mention that because one of the things that we've talked about a lot in this coaching search, or the anticipation of the coaching search, is the style of play. And I've heard so many IU fans complain over time, and I don't disagree with them, that they really don't want someone who plays insanely slow. Like when you bring Tony Bennett up to people, once they start like talking about losing to Maryland, Baltimore County in the first round, they'll immediately go to, wow, I'd hate to watch Indiana play that style night in and night out, even if it's successful. We'll put that aside for the moment. If you look at his time at UCLA, he's had kind of a weird period because, of course, he started at UCLA right at the dawn of COVID. That team was 19-12, 12-6, was probably going to make the NCAA tournament, but was not very highly regarded in KenPom. It was 78th in KenPom when the season stopped. But then he went to the Final Four the next year. There's an asterisk there that we'll come back to. And then had consecutive Sweet 16 seasons as a 4 seed in 2022 and as a 2 seed last year as one of the best teams in the country. They end up losing below seed expectation in that game. So that's essentially kind of the capsule of Mick Cronin when it comes to tempo and tournament performance. Now, one of the things that you'd say about Cronin is that, generally speaking, even though his teams have been slow, they had a streak there, that 2021, 22, and 23 streak, where they were very efficient offensively. They were 11th in offensive efficiency in the country in 2021, 12th the following year, 21st the year after that. And that 2023 year was particularly impressive because they were also second in the country in defensive efficiency. Now, you go back to his Cincinnati era, he never really got to the point where his teams were ever that good offensively. Like, you go all the way back to the start of his time at Cincinnati in 2007 and run it all the way through to 2019. He never had a team in the top 30 KenPom efficiency ratings for offense. defensively, his teams were very good. That last 6 years at Cincinnati, last 7 years, his teams ranked 15th, 9th, 17th, 16th, 15th, 2nd, and 28th. It was a really impressive run defensively. Hasn't really been able to get that consistently at Cincinnati or at UCLA, but was 16th in 2022. This year, they're 18th in defensive efficiency. So those are kind of the big picture numbers. Scott, your overall thoughts on Mick Cronin and any other statistical items that you've noticed that you think are worth bringing up?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I was looking at is obviously the tempo is slow, but I also agree. A lot of the guys we're going to talk about today are tempo is slow, but it's like I go back to the Tony Bennett thing. Like, yeah, I don't know if I'd want to watch that style of play, but I sure as hell would want to watch us win a title. It's like, and Virginia was mostly irrelevant before Tony Bennett got there, and they're kind of irrelevant now. We've been kind of irrelevant. So I will take it if we win.
Yes.
Yeah. The thing that I was looking at with Cronin is, take the tempo aside. The keys, when you look at kind of start digging into the Ken Pom numbers, normally the teams that do really well in the tournament are teams that are like top 50 in both adjusted offense and adjusted defense. And I look at that as kind of like, okay, once you get one of those teams that has a lot of the pieces that could get a really good run in the tournament, what do you do with it? And this is kind of the Crean thing where you have that team in 2011 or 2012, 2013 that was really good. And it's like, you hit the wall. That team was kind of falling apart at the end, and then they lose to Syracuse, so Cronin can definitely get there. So I'm going to pick a couple of years out, just kind of going backwards chronologically and just talk about what they did and what happened to them at the end of the season. So in 2022, that UCLA team was 12th of offense, 16th defense. That's a really good team, ranked 11th in Ken Pom. It's a team that went 15-5 in the Pac-12. Did well, but they get to the end. They're a 4 seed in the tournament, losing the Sweet 16, 73-66 to North Carolina, a team that was lower seeded than them, and they lost by a pretty, a healthy margin. That's not awesome. We'll go back another couple years. We'll go to the 2023 UCLA team. That team was 3rd in the country, 21st offense, 2nd defense. That is a hell of a team. Lost by 3 in the Sweet 16 to Gonzaga. Okay, like that one, you chalk it up to like, hey, you played a really good team in Gonzaga. You were a 2 seed. They were a 3 seed. That happens in the tournament. You go back to Cincinnati in the 2017 year. That's a team that was 34th on offense, 15th on defense. So the hallmarks of a really good run. They're a 6 seed because I think partially because of their conference, but they lost in their, the AAC conference to SMU. They lose in the second round to UCLA, but they lose by 13. And that's not awesome. And then I'll end with this. You go to the 2012 season with Cincinnati. They're 62nd in offense, 22nd in defense. So not great offense. This is kind of skirting the limits of what I'd consider as a great team. And it's a team that you see in their record, had a 3-game losing streak, finished 12-6 in, or that's still the AAC that year, or the Big East, sorry. But they lose to Ohio State, who's the 2nd team in the country that year, but 81-66. So that would be the only thing that I would say is a bit of a hallmark, is it does feel a little bit Crean-esque in that I think he can get a program to a point. He has shown that when he starts to get his team and kind of that elite humming level, he has a lot of situations where he's losing to lower seeded teams. He's losing by sizable margins. And the Gonzaga one, again, that happens in the tournament. It's just too bad. That's really the only one. Every other loss is a lower seeded team. It's by almost double digits. And so that would be, I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just like looking at it. It's like, hey, it's great. That would be the piece that I would look at is like, are we going to have somebody who has kind of a hard limiter up top of what he can do when he builds, a really elite team?
Well, and look, I think that 2023 game against Gonzaga in the Sweet 16 is a really interesting one to look at because UCLA, they put a big run on at the end of the first half. They ended up taking a 46-33 lead into half.
Yeah, the game log of that one is insane.
It's wild because like UCLA's up 59-52 with about 13 minutes left in that game. And they let up a 20-3 run where they basically, UCLA barely scored between the 13-minute mark and the 5-minute mark. Then they put a huge rush on at the end. They end up getting it kind of close. And in fact, there was one possession where I think they took a brief lead, and then Gonzaga ends up executing at the end.
And to go, Gonzaga's 96% to win. With 30 seconds to go, they're 36% to win, and then they win the game.
Now, I think it's important to note that was a good Gonzaga team. Drew Timme was on that team. And I think to some degree, whoever came out of that game was going to be in real trouble in the next game because they were going to have to play UConn. I mean, Gonzaga got smoked by that UConn team in the Elite Eight. But UCLA that season, that 2023 season, was the number 3 team in KenPom at the end of the year. And, how they got there was really interesting. And this is where I do like some of what Cronin brings to the table, because he clearly is focusing on efficiency. That year's team, and in fact, let me call that season up so you can all see it here on the sheet. Like, if you look, they're 21st in offensive efficiency, 2nd in defensive efficiency. They played relatively slow, but 235th is fine. That's kind of median in the country. But they were great at not turning the ball over while simultaneously turning their opponents over. They held their opponents to a really low effective field goal percentage. UCLA was a great offensive rebounding team that year. They shot fine from 3. They were top 150. They were great at stealing the basketball. The one thing that I think IU fans, maybe with a bit of PTSD on, is that that UCLA was 343rd in the country in the number of 3-point attempts they took. And to me, like, this is the big question mark, not just with this coach, with Mick Cronin, but with others. It's like, his teams shoot okay. Like, if you look at their effective field goal percentages over time, he's not a shot doctor. He's only had 2 years, I guess, if you count this year, in his time at UCLA, where his teams are in the top 100 in terms of shooting. And if you go back to his Cincinnati era, his teams did not shoot particularly well. I don't think he had any seasons at Cincinnati. He didn't, where his teams were top 100 in effective field goal percentage. So I do worry a little bit with Cronin in terms of, and we'll get back to having us on screen here. I do worry a bit about Cronin, that I think he's clearly a good coach. I mean, you don't have that kind of a win percentage without being a good coach. He's clearly got a system that works. We've seen what the highs can be at UCLA, obviously going to a Final Four, but even that, there's a little bit of a caveat there, which is that was the COVID year, not the year where the tournament stopped, but the year where half the teams in the NCAA didn't even play non-conference games. There were games getting canceled. UCLA in that season, I think it's worth noting, yes, they made the Final Four.
Were they a play-in team?
They were a play-in game team. They had to go to overtime to beat Michigan State.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, look, give them all the credit in the world. From there, they rattle off. They beat higher-seeded BYU, who was the 6th seed. They beat Abilene Christian, who had been an upset, darling that year. Abilene Christian had beaten Texas in the first round by a point. UCLA ends up boat racing them in that game. They beat Alabama in overtime. Alabama was very good. They beat that Michigan team that was kind of like the one good Juwan Howard year, and they beat them by 2. So, and then they took that shot at the end of the Final Four game.
Right.
That 3-pointer as time expired by who took that? It was Jalen Suggs, right?
Yeah.
That game was in overtime. That was a dynamite game. Like, UCLA scored 1.22 points per possession in that game. It was back and forth the whole way. It's just that Gonzaga scored 1.26 points per possession. So there is a little bit of an asterisk there in terms of, like, how often are you going to get a play-in game team all the way to the Final Four? It's only happened a couple of times. All that to say, though, I think as I've looked at Cronin, I'm a little less hesitant with him than I was before in terms of his results. But I do have the same issue that you have, which is I don't know if what that Final Four season told us is really indicative because of how screwed up that season was. And one of the candidates we're going to talk about next has the exact same kind of asterisk on their resume. It's still a big accomplishment to get to a Final Four. It's just that year, I don't know how much we can extrapolate, because you take that year out, and Cronin, as long as he's coached and as good of a win percentage as he has 3 total Sweet 16s outside of that season. And it's not like Cincinnati was in the hinterlands. I mean, the Big East and the American Conference were both capable of throwing teams up that could get that to that point or farther.
My only thing is, and I just don't know enough about UCLA day to day, but UCLA is a true blue blood program. And they're coming off of the Alford years after you hire Cronin after Alford, so not a great end to that. He has a Final Four, 2 Sweet 16s. Last year was not as great. this year. They're on track to be one of his better teams. They're going to be in the tournament. My question would be, and this is unfortunately going to take a step away from Indiana exceptionalism, why does Cronin want out? Like, why would he want to leave?
Well,
like, unless it's a little bit more money or support. But like, and again, I don't know, but like, if the Heat's getting turned up at UCLA because you had one bad year, it's like that's going to happen here. Like, that would be my other question. Is it seems like he's got a pretty good thing going there. That's one of the elite programs. Why would you want to leave?
Well, and it's a great question. And from what I've been able to piece together, the problem is very much the support. Okay. And this is a problem at other schools. I mean, there was a report today that was floating around on Twitter as an example of another program having similar issues, that Iowa's NIL collective ran out of money this year. And that they were having to write, like the guy running the program was having to write checks like out of his personal account because they have a contract with these players. So like you've got a lot of programs that don't actually have
story.
I know. Well, I think people people do not realize how great of a job Hoosiers Connect and IU have done with assembling a war chest for NIL. And you would think like UCLA, of course, they would have all that. They don't. They don't have that. I mean, look at the arena they play in. Like Pauley Pavilion, for a program that's won 11 national titles, is a pretty pedestrian place to go play. We get to watch a lot of those games now on Big Ten Network. The seats are not full. It's just not the same type of thing. And I think Cronin, especially if you read between the lines of what happened last year, which was a disastrous kind of year for them, I think he's having trouble competing in the recruiting space, and he wants to get to a place where you can do that. And it's actually, that's one of the arguments for, I think, why the IU job is so appealing to a number of people. You put the last 25 years of results aside, the money that you have to go spend in NIL is going to be one of the huge things. And not every program and not every school is going to be able to pay the full $22 million. You don't have to. It's not a requirement. UCLA, that's an athletic department that's in deep, deep, deep trouble from a financial perspective for a variety of reasons, not just the lack of like ready-made donors, but also, they signed a very disastrous contract with Under Armour that they then had to cancel. And they're so far in debt. That's why they jumped out of the Pac-12 to go to the Big Ten in the first place.
But they made a great football hire.
Wow. So all those things considered, I think that's why Cronin wants to get out. And look, ultimately, it's like, I look at what he's done at UCLA so far as kind of treading water with what we've seen UCLA can do. I mean, Steve Alford, who we know is not a great tournament coach, got to 3 Sweet 16s while he was at UCLA. Ben Howland, got to 2 straight championship games or 2 straight Final Fours, and then had a bunch of second and first round exits. Steve Lavin, got to 5 Sweet 16s and an Elite 8. UCLA always thinks they can do better. And it's funny in the context of the IU job, how many people look at UCLA and say, well, no one says you can only do so much at UCLA because of their history. But realistically, you look at their last 25 years, and there's a real hard cap on what you can do at UCLA unless everything comes together. So it's an interesting question.
In LA too. Yeah, you have Luka taking away all the money.
Exactly. The one last thing about Cronin, though, is his public presentation, his press conferences. Like, you either love what the guy is saying or you hate what the guy is saying. There's a part of me that's like, I will get really annoyed having to listen to this guy whine constantly in press conferences. And if you're winning, nobody cares. But when you're not winning, or when you're losing at home to Minnesota and then blaming fans for like not being supportive enough of players, and that's why they're missing free throws, like that could get old real fast. And for a guy who's still relatively young, like still going to be like 53, 54 years old when he would start here, I'm not sure if I'm like that excited about signing up for that particular thing. But it's also one of those things that doesn't really matter. It's more of an aesthetic choice than a coaching thing.
When you also have, like, we're not going to talk about him today, but the TJ, I'm going to mess his name up, TJ Otzenberger.
I think it's Otzelberger, but yes.
Otzelberger, but like you have the two extremes of like Ben Howland, who's going a size up on everything he gets, where like every suit is like frumpy and big. And then Otzenberger is like, do you have a smaller version of a kid's small polo I can wear? Like the two extremes of clothing sizes. But anyway, let's move on to our next one.
Yeah, let's move on to the next one because we wanted to get through a few others here. Anyway, let me just ask you real quick. If they hired Mick Cronin, what would be your level of excitement on a scale of 0 to 100?
That's a great question. I'm a little going through this. I'm a little bit more excited, but probably like in the 70s.
Yeah.
I'm not loving it. I'm worried about the high level success. Like, are you going to be able to take that next level? But, where we've been for a while, like maybe having mid to mid high success is good. The thing that I like, and we're not going to talk about Dusty May today, but I also like the equation of, you're in a conference with UCLA and you're hurting them. And so there is something that I do kind of like about, this is a cutthroat game we're playing now in college athletics. If we can also hurt one of our competitors, we're going to play yearly. Let's do that. So I like that piece there. But yeah, I'd be in the probably low 70s.
I think I'm at about a 63. I could probably talk myself into it. And look, I don't think he'd be a disaster. Like, I don't think it would be a tremendous step back. It just, I'll always feel like they probably could have done better in this search, because look, honestly.
Well, it would feel like we didn't get our first choice.
No, absolutely. Well, it was a shock when Mick Cronin got the UCLA job after they fired Alford, because they had gone after a bunch of other people. And then they had made the announcement that Mick Cronin was going to UCLA. And it's like, what? Like, what that? And look, he's had more success than I think most people would have expected. But he was also desperately trying to get the Louisville job last year, and they didn't hire him.
Yeah.
So that begs some questions.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on to our second candidate, an Indiana native, a guy that we've heard increasing things about, and that's Scott Drew. Scott Drew, of course, the son of Homer Drew, who was the longtime head coach at Valparaiso, the brother of Bryce Drew, famous for the shot in the 98 tournament, and who was the coach at Vanderbilt for a while. I think Bryce Drew's at is it Grand Canyon now, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, Scott Drew, he coached 1 year at Valparaiso and then went to Baylor. And of course, he went to Baylor right in the middle of one of the worst scandals in college basketball history, where former Bob Knight assistant Dave Bliss was fired and was found to have tried to have covered up the murder of one of the players on his team by one of his teammates, I forget all the details. That it was an ugly situation. Anyway, that program essentially got a 4-year death penalty, and that's what Scott Drew started as coaching. Scott Drew, on the course of his career, has a 646 win percentage, but this is one of those cases, and we talk about whether or not you count certain years or not. If you excuse the first 4 years of Scott Drew's time at Baylor, which I think is fair given the full totality of the situation.
We're back to that. It's the Crean discussion.
If you take those 4 years out, his winning percentage rises to 697, which is actually better than Mick Cronin's career win percentage. He's 182 and 128 if you take those first 4 years out in the Big 12, which is a 587 win percentage. One national title in 2021, which was that same COVID year that I was talking about earlier. 2 Elite Eights outside of that in 2010 and 2012. 2 Sweet 16s, a 2014 one and a 2017 one. 2 Big 12 regular season titles, and then 1 title in the Mid-Continent Conference when he was with Valparaiso. If you look at Scott Drew, 20 and 11 overall in the NCAA tournament, but I think it's worth noting that from 2018 to the present day, he's got 1 national title, 4 second-round exits, and an NIT appearance. So this is one of those situations, as we saw with Cronin, where it's like, well, and I'm going to go ahead and throw Scott Drew's resume up here on the video for those of you who are paying attention. Scott Drew, the fact that his 1 title at Baylor comes in a season when it's a very weird season, and Baylor played a lot more games than a lot of other teams did. They played 30 games that year. Some teams didn't even get to 20. But you can't deny that Scott Drew, plays a slow tempo, much like Mick Cronin. We talked about that. Not any seasons since 2013 where they've been in the top 150 of tempo, but has had pretty efficient teams overall. You look at a lot of the high water marks. Scott Drew has really done a great job on the offensive front. You go through some of his seasons at Baylor. If you go back and start in like 2008, he's had the 19th, 14th, 5th, 13th, 19th, 10th, 13th, 14th, 23rd, 20th, 17th, 2nd, 8th, 2nd, 6th, and 12th ranked offenses. This is a guy who knows how to run really efficient offense. His defenses haven't been quite as good, quite frankly, but they have been at times. Like in 2020, that COVID year when they would have been a 1 seed, they had the 4th most efficient defense in college basketball. And then they were 22nd in the country in 21. They were 13th in the country in 2022. The hallmarks of his teams are kind of all over the place. Like, he has metamorphosized quite a bit in terms of what his teams do well. They do tend to be really, really good on the offensive glass. They really emphasize offensive rebounding, like to an extreme degree, which is one of the reasons why they are so good in terms of efficiency. They've had years where they've shot really well. They've had years where they've shot terribly, but they've always been a really good offensive rebounding team. That's kind of the hallmark. Defensively speaking, they've kind of gone back and forth. And again, they don't really emphasize keeping their opponents off the offensive glass. What they do seem to be emphasizing, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, is forcing turnovers. And they've done that with last year as an exception about as well as anybody in the country over that time period. They do shoot a decent amount of threes, not an insane amount like a Nate Oates team, but they shoot top half in terms of overall three-point attempts versus total field goal attempts. So, that's essentially kind of Baylor in a nutshell. The one thing I'd also like to note, Scott, before I hand it off to you, is, I think it's important that we not just do these things in a vacuum, that we look at, like, what is the historical resume of the schools that these guys coach at. So if you go to Baylor, go to the basketball reference page, this is the Scott Drew era. And you can see, like, it's dotted with tournament appearances. Obviously, you've got that national title. If you scroll back to the pre-Scott Drew era, look at their tournament appearances. They basically don't have any. They went to the tournament in 1988 under Gene Iba. And then prior to that, the last time they've been in the NCAA tournament was 1950. So one thing I want to note about Scott Drew is that what he's accomplished at Baylor has been accomplished at a school that does not care about basketball, had no history of caring about basketball, had no history of being good at basketball, and somehow he has turned this program in the middle of Texas, in the middle of football country, into a basketball powerhouse over the course of time. So with that, I'll hand it off to you and get your thoughts.
Yeah, no, you hit on a lot of things. I mean, the thing that I want to circle back to is the offensive rebounding, because I think that is something that would play. I mean, it plays really well anywhere, but it would play really well in Indiana. And not just they've been good, starting in 2014 for 9 straight years. Well, let me rephrase it this way. Since 2014, they've been a top 30 offensive rebounding team every year. Just hard stop. But for 9 years, they were in the top 10. 3rd, 1st, 4th, 3rd, 9th, 2nd, 8th, 5th, 7th. And then in 2013, they slipped all the way to 22nd. I mean, it's hard green all up there. And I think that's something would play really well here.
I love hard as a modifier for green. I'm gonna remember that one. That's great. We already had the mean green. Now we get hard green.
Right. Whereas our charts are hard blue. It's
we have a lot of hard blue. Firm blue. Let's use that instead.
Firm. Yes, I like that. But I mean, and you also hit the other thing that again, just circling back, it's a great point. This is at Baylor. And so, yes, it's a guy who's won a title, so it's hard to say, he's not had a ton of elite level success in the tournament. If you take the one title year out, which is a big thing to take out, but just take it out, you have some of those earlier exits with teams that maybe should have done a little more.
Right.
The question you do have to ask is, unlike UCLA with Cronin, is it less about the coaching and more just about the entire environment of like what is, and I just don't know, but I'm assuming recruiting is tougher in Baylor. There's probably less resources. Texas is a great basketball state, but Baylor's probably not getting the highest level talent. So you do wonder if the limiter of what you can do at Baylor is less about Scott Drew and more just about Baylor. But he still won an effing title. He's still got a title and he's still got a ring. There's something to that. Here's the thing is the numbers are great. Like, just you look at it, like what he built there, it's unbelievable. Port that success to Indiana in.
Yeah.
I will take it all day long. The question that, and this is honestly, I don't keep enough into kind of the weeds of the rumor mill of basketball. It always seems like whenever people talk about Scott Drew, it's like, ooh, is it just that incident? Is there also like recruiting stuff? Like it feels like he brings some of that Kelvin Sampson-esque baggage where it's like, can Indiana handle that? And I'm not even sure I fully know it, but it seems like outside of the baggage, Scott Drew's perfect. Everything else looks really good. It just seems like I've always heard like it's a cultural fit that may not work. And I'm not sure I know why that would be.
Well, I'll say this. Like, a lot of IU fans are still convinced that Scott Drew tried to get like Hunter Mascara Perea deported, which if you go back and look at that actual sequence of events, A, that was an assistant coach, and B, I'm still not totally convinced by the people who have claimed that, because if you go look at what was actually said, it kind of plays out differently. But outside, you get outside of that, any recruiting violations that have occurred, frankly, aren't violations anymore. And I've never seen a notice of allegations from Baylor during that time period for anything. And Drew clearly had nothing to do with the initial incident that brought him there in the first place, and he had to clean a ton of that up. So I don't see any issues there. The fascinating thing about Drew to me,
with all of this, he's still young. He's like 54.
Yeah, he's going to be 55 at the start of the 2025-26 season. He's already won 483 games. He was clearly a high-level candidate for the Kentucky job last year, and he ended up turning that down, and a lot of that was in effort to get an arena built at Baylor, which I believe they did get passed. One of the other things that's really fascinating about this, he's done all this at a school whose arena is smaller than like 5 or 6 Indiana high school gyms. Like, Foster Pavilion seats 7,500 people. This is a tiny ass gym.
You're right, 7,500.
Yeah. So I do think that there's a lot to recommend in terms of Drew, and I think the operative question really is what you just brought up, like the fact that we even think of Baylor as a major job is entirely because of Scott Drew. Entirely because of Scott Drew. And I was pretty lukewarm on this particular candidate until I started digging in, and you realize how little success they've had and what a terrible starting point he dealt with, and the fact that he's had to metamorphosize how he's coached based upon who he can get to come there. I've also always been fascinated with Baylor in terms of the types of players they get. They are always uber athletic. Like, it's a type of player that IU rarely ever gets.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to watch that type of recruiting in Indiana, because I think with Indiana's resources and the style of play that Baylor's got, and the fact that he's won a national title at Baylor, that's a huge feather in the cap of the recruiting process, because it looks like a fun school to go play for. It looks like a fun program to go play for. The other thing I'll note is that right now, according to everything I've been able to tell, he's making $2.7 million a year.
Yep. No, I'm happy. I was looking at that too. It's like, and Woodson makes like 4.4. So, you can just be like, hey, do you want two good things? You could double your salary, and you don't have to live and wait in middle of Texas anymore. You're out of Baylor. You can move out of there. I think those are, and he has the connections to the Indiana. I'm not sure how tight they are, but he could walk in and he has an Indiana connection. He played at Valpo. And I would say this too,
he played it at Butler. He actually he's a Butler alum, but he coached at Valpo. You're fine.
Yeah. The other thing too is that we talked a lot about this in the last podcast, when you kind of look at the profile a lot of the good coaches in college basketball today, and he obviously doesn't fit that, but he kind of does in the Bruce Pearl, Rick Barnes, it's Kelvin Sampson. There are a couple examples of guys who, I'm just going to use baggage, have a little bit of side baggage, but obviously can coach in the college ranks, and he would fit those. So I think it's also a fit that shows that it would work in the, just like Barnes and Bruce Pearl in those respects.
Putting this year aside, since there's still some time left in the season, but in the previous 13 seasons, he won 20 games in 12 of them and 19 games in the other season. It is a really he's had an unbroken string of postseason appearances dating back to 2011, 2012. 2 of those were NIT appearances, but one of them was an NIT championship. So, it's really hard to argue with the track record. And again, this was not a name when it was first brought up that I was that excited about. And the question is if he's going to turn down Kentucky, would he really take Indiana? But I think there may be some possibilities there. Who knows? He may just be very comfortable at Baylor, be like, look what I built over the last 20 years. Why would I want to leave? But I think if there was a job that he might leave Baylor for, if it wasn't Kentucky, and I could see Kentucky from an outsider's perspective, at least somebody from the state of Indiana being like, I don't know if I want that kind of heat Indiana is a similar kind of heat, but it's different because you're aware of it. You grew up in the state. Now he doesn't have any direct ties to IU, so maybe that doesn't matter at all. But
I kind of like that. Like as he tried to,
if he was interested, I don't know why you wouldn't offer him the job, because he looks like the exact type of candidate that would come right in, would establish a culture that clearly has worked at a place where there isn't a basketball culture. And I think it would be a really fascinating hire, and one that really, as you said, checks a lot of boxes. So we'll end with this one, with the question I asked before. What would be your level of excitement from 0 to 100 if this was the hire?
Just two quick more things. Like I do think for Scott Drew, he's kind of at that moment that Mark Few had a couple of years ago, where like if he turns down Kentucky, and then this year if he's rumored and then turns down Indiana, it's kind of like, do you want to leave? And not that it's wrong, but do you want to leave or not? Like, are you going to be a lifer at Baylor or not? It feels like we're at that inflection point where now, like, Mark Few isn't even brought up as like he's just going to stay at Gonzaga. And it does now. Obviously, if Few wanted to go somewhere, he could probably go where he wanted to. But it does feel like this is that moment where if Drew wanted to leave, he would leave. I also, as somebody who wants to kind of shake things up, the idea of Baylor being a fun team and like them playing with like neon yellow jerseys, like the idea of like having neon red jerseys at Indiana would be awesome. So for me, I would be, you gave an exact number last time, so I'm going to do that. I'd probably be like an 82 or an 83. I mean, from my point, I'm done caring about baggage. I'm done caring about, we have to do, the only way we got to do it the right way is winning games. Like, is our score better than their score? That's the right way at my point. And he has shown an ability to win. He's shown an ability to win at a high level. As you said, he recruits at a cool level, and he not only brought a program up, it is a cool, fun program. Like Baylor kind of has that. It's like a cool vibe with the team. I want all of it. So yes, I'm 86. I'm upping it, man. I'm going up already. 86. I'm in.
I'm at about a 90 with Scott Drew. I went in at about a 50. That's what I mean. I did not go in thinking I really like the idea of Scott Drew as the IU men's basketball coach, but the more I look into it from a basketball perspective, I don't see the downside. I really don't. The one question is, can his success at Baylor translate to IU, which is at a different spot than it has been historically? But I don't know why it wouldn't translate, and I think the ceiling would be higher at a place like IU because of the resources and because of just the overall setup and the fact that people do care about basketball at IU. So we'll see. That's a really fascinating one. Let's go to our third of the four that we're going to talk about today. Not as exciting of a candidate, I would argue, but certainly a name that gets brought up quite a bit whenever the IU job comes up, and that's Brad Brownell. So Brad Brownell, currently at Clemson, and he's been at Clemson for quite a while. He got to Clemson in 2010, and that 2010-2011 season was the first year. So he's been there for about 15 years.
If you're listening on Spotify right now, you should take your speed down to 0.8, because I mean his tempo is the slowest in the country. I mean, they run a slow tempo, so we should just slow the podcast down now.
Yeah, they are certainly. He is more in the Mick Cronin era of tempo than the Scott Drew, which is still slow, but more around the median point. So Brownell, he'll be 57 at the start of the college basketball season, so older than the first two guys we've talked about. Has a .618 career win percentage, and that includes 4 years at UNC Wilmington and 4 years at Wright State. He's an Evansville native. Actually went to high school. Was a teammate with Calbert Chaney at the other Harrison High School, as I call it, having gone to West Lafayette Harrison myself in high school. Brownell, 6-7 career NCAA tournament record. Has only made the tournament 4 times total at Clemson. Has one Elite Eight, and that was, of course, last year. And that was an unexpected run, shall we say, to the Elite Eight. They were a 6 seed, and if you recall, they beat New Mexico, Baylor, ironically, Arizona in the Sweet 16, and then they lost that game to Alabama 89-82, which was a relatively close game. Alabama was the better team for most of it and ended up winning by about 9 points at the end. 7 points, sorry. You look at what, and then he had a Sweet 16 back in 2018, but not a lot of tournament success for Brad Brownell or even tournament appearances for Brownell. When you look at his page on KenPom, what you find, as Scott alluded to, is very slow tempo. This year's Clemson squad, which is a really good Clemson squad, mind you. Like, this is a team that'll probably be a top 6 seed, maybe even top 4 in what's been not that great of an ACC, obviously. But they're 342nd in tempo in the country. They've been pretty slow every year except 2023, a year that I'll note they did not make the NCAA tournament. He has not had a lot of top 20 performances in either offensive or defensive efficiency. They're kind of spotty. I guess you would probably say, looking at the totality of his career, is he's a bit more of a defensive coach now. And that's kind of been the consistent thing throughout the course of his career at Clemson. He's had some pretty poor offenses in terms of being sub 100 in the rankings. They do not shoot a ton of threes this year, but they did shoot a lot of threes over the course of the last several seasons. And outside of that, it's a kind of a middling record overall. I mean, I think a lot of why Brownell gets mentioned is because he's got direct ties to IU, not just being an Evansville native, but also having coached under Jim Cruz. He's got some Knight DNA in terms of the way his teams play. Clemson is a weird program in terms of like where it sits in the hierarchy of the ACC. I'll get to that in a minute, but let me get your overall thoughts on him and like where he sits in terms of your thought process.
He sits low. I mean, I'm not even going to go too deep into the numbers, because here's the number I want to go at is he's been at Clemson 15 years. And I'll give him that he's going to make the tournament this year. It definitely looks like they're making the tournament. That's 5 tournaments in 15 years. Over the last 15 years for Indiana basketball, we've made the tournament 6 times in 15 years. So, I mean, we can dig into the numbers and how they play. And, he just isn't making the turn. Like, what are we doing that's better? We've made it 6 times. He's made it 5. It feels like we're just going to get a lot of the same, and that's the best track record he has. And like you could say, well, he's making the tournament now back-to-back years. It's like, great. So it takes him 13 years to turn around Clemson to get it humming. I mean, again, you go back and look at what Scott Drew did at Baylor, which has way less resources and history than Clemson. It's not there. Even you go back to when Brownell was coaching at Wright State. He made the tournament once, and that was his first year. When he was at Wilmington, he made it twice. I would not be a high number. We'll get to numbers at the end here, but it would feel as if Indiana hires this, it felt like, man, who do we strike out on? Like, we really struck out. And if the answer is Indiana ties, it's like, dude, we've been there. Yeah. We've done that. Didn't work. Like, is that what we're back to? A guy, I would be very disappointed in this hire. And it's just based on, you got to be able to get your team to the tournament for Christ's sake. Sorry.
Well, I agree. And I think, I mean, it'd be one thing if Clemson had the history that Baylor had, where you just never got to the tournament. But if you go back and look through the history, I mean, Oliver Purnell, who famously left Clemson because he didn't feel like he was getting enough support for DePaul, left Clemson for DePaul, but he made the tournament 3 years in a row, his last 3 years. Rick Barnes was coaching at Clemson, made an a Sweet 16 and 2 first rounds, and then left, also because there wasn't a huge amount of support. Cliff Ellis made it to a Sweet 16. Granted, he cheated to get there, but he made 3 tournaments in like 6 years. And so there's no question that Clemson is under-resourced compared to some of the big programs in the ACC. It doesn't have the resources of a North Carolina or a Duke or a Louisville. But, I mean, you think about some of the programs, think about Tony Bennett at Virginia. Like, whatever you want to say about Tony Bennett's approach or style, like, you cannot deny that Bennett, the run of success he had at a Virginia program that was not a regular attendee of the NCAA tournament was striking. You look at, some other examples, like you go back and look at Florida State, and it's like, over a 5-year span, Leonard Hamilton got to 3 Sweet 16s, an Elite 8 in the second round, and did the same thing in a 4-year stretch earlier. And Florida State's certainly not better resourced in basketball than Clemson is. So I'm with you on this. I mean, I think it's impressive that he's finally gotten Clemson to the point where they're going to win 20 games 3 years in a row. They're going to make the NCAA tournament twice in a row. They were right on the bubble in 2022-23. But I'm with you. Like, I don't see the rationale here. I don't know why his name would even be brought up if he didn't have the tie to the state of Indiana.
No, it feels as if he just has a great agent. Like his agent should get Agent of the Year awards. Like him and Tom Allen's agent should both be fighting for Agent of the Year.
Yeah, that's, I think, a fair point. So, okay, well, so your excitement level with Brad Brownell if he's hired?
I'd be in the I'd be, I'm pulling up 19.2 because that's our average possession length on Ken Palm. So I'd be at 19.2.
Great, I love it. I think I'd be at about a 25.
Right.
Because there's younger candidates out there who have more success, and B, like I can't think of a single person outside of like a small cadre of people in the city of Evansville who would be legitimately excited to have Brad Brownell as the head coach. And I count myself in the group of people that would not be excited, obviously.
Same.
All right, final candidate that we'll get to today, and it's one I keep seeing as like people almost classifying it as like a no-brainer, and it's Ben McCollum. So Ben McCollum, currently the head coach at Drake, and he's only been there. This is his first year at Drake, and Drake is doing very well. They're 24-3 so far on the season, and their 3 losses are by a combined 13 points. They are right now leading the Missouri Valley by a full game. And McCollum, of course, even though he's only been there for a year, has some background. He's going to be 44 years old at the start of the next season, so he's very young. He's an Iowa City native, which is interesting and worth keeping in mind. He won 4 NCAA Division II championships at Northwest Missouri State. So he's kind of a legend at the D2 level. Kind of, it's reminiscent to some degree of like Bo Ryan, who got the call up, went to coach at Wisconsin Milwaukee, then quickly got hired at Wisconsin and became, a top 10 coach in Big Ten history. So McCollum's kind of split critical opinion in some degree because of the immediate success he's had at Drake. And a lot of people are like, this is the next young hot commodity. This is like the Bob Knight of this era, who, of course, famously got hired at IU when he was like 35 years old. You'd be foolish if you didn't go get this guy now. That's kind of how the pro McCollum argument has gone. But Scott, we've talked about slow paces with Mick Cronin and with Brad Brownell. Like, they are quicksilver compared to what Ben McCollum has done thus far this season. Drake is 364th in tempo this year. They're averaging 59 possessions a game. They have one of the slowest average possession lengths per game. And while they've been impressive in certain aspects of their metrics, he's largely doing this with 4 guys that he brought with him from the Division II level: Bennett Sturtz, Mitch Mascari, Daniel Abreu, and Isaiah Jackson. He's cobbled together a roster, which I think is impressive, a combination of D2 guys and a couple of JUCOs, including Tavian Banks, who's their top scorer, or at least their top possession user this year in terms of the total number of possessions he takes. But I think it's worth noting that when you look at what he's doing minutes-wise, Bennett Sturtz has played the most minutes in college basketball this year. Mitch Mascari has played the second most minutes in college basketball this year. It's a really tight rotation. I don't know how repeatable it is, and it strikes me that this would be a really dangerous hire for IU, given that this seems kind of like a unicorn season for Drake, and not in terms of like you can't have success at Drake, because you can, but I don't know how much of what you see this year with McCollum is really translatable even up to the mid-tier level, let alone the Big Ten.
Before I get to my deeper thoughts, my question is, who does Ben McCollum look more like? Doug Gottlieb or Joe Gatto from Impractical Jokers? I would argue more the latter. I think saying he looks like Gottlieb is really unfortunate. I think you should apologize to Ben McCollum for that. He looks like someone else, and I can't quite figure out who else he looks like, but it will come to me at some point. If you ever meet him, it's a great thing. You look like somebody else. I don't know who. Tell me who you look like. Here's it's really tough to dig into the numbers. I've been looking at that for a while. It's tough to dig into the numbers because it all becomes D2, and it's just hard. How much does D2 translate to D1? His Ken Pom page obviously only has Drake. The D2 stuff is very it's impressive, because when you look at it, starting in 2013, it's in D2, but it's Sweet 16, Sweet 16, Sweet 16 champion, first round champion. 2020 was canceled. Champion, second round, Sweet 16. Just a ton of success. Here's what I think is interesting with this one is I feel like right now is probably the only moment. If you're Scott Dolson and you sit down with Ben McCollum and you're like, I think this guy is the best candidate out there. I think he meets all the parameters of what we want, and he is the next Bob Knight. You are in an interesting window where it does feel like right now is the only time in the last 25 years you could hire a guy like this, because you have the cover of saying, look, this is Cignetti for basketball. Like, we did it in football. It's a guy who went from D2 to D1. He brought his players over. He ported it. He's a winner at every level, and he's shown that he can turn around a program. I mean, Drake was actually pretty good the year before, but he can get success at the D1 level immediately. You're basically saying this is Cignetti. We did it there. We're going to do it again here. 4 years ago, 8 years ago, this wouldn't even be a conversation, because IU would have felt like we are too good to be in that pool. Right now, people might still feel that way, but there is a feel of like, I want the Cignetti high I had 8 months ago with basketball. And so I do look at it as, you have that cover if you're IU and you feel that he is the best option. Everything you said is right. It's a little bit, can it work? Can it be replicated? But, there's a lot of colleges right now in, Michigan State, maybe UCLA, other programs who are looking at it, and it's like, man, I wish we had the stones to hire Cignetti, but we didn't. And we weren't in a position, and IU was well placed. In a weird way, IU is in a very advantageous position because we're so down and we have that. So that's what I find really interesting about it. Whether he is the next best coach or is that best option, I don't know that answer.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think sometimes there are translational issues between football and basketball. And I think it's important to note, first of all, the Cignetti hire will be studied for years by people who will be like, how the hell did this happen? Like, how did you hire a coach at that level and immediately have him turn around a 3-win football program or a 4-win football program into one that made the college football playoff?
The worst football program.
Using transfers from the group of 5 and an entire coaching staff transplant with the exception of one guy. I don't think that's something you want to chase in basketball because I just don't think it translates quite the same. And B, I think ultimately the thing about Cignetti is that it wasn't that he just had success at the lower level, got to the mid-major level of college football, and then got hired up. Like, he also had success at James Madison.
Right.
They were on the precipice of, getting an AQ spot for a bowl. There were a lot of things that were happening in that 2 or 3 years prior to him getting there, or prior to him getting hired by IU. I mean, while he was at James Madison. The problem, to some degree, with McCollum was really a couple of specific problems. First of all, I feel like it's a little easier to hack a college basketball season at the mid-major level by doing exactly what he's chosen to do, slowing the tempo way down, really focusing on things like offensive rebounding and getting to the free throw line, and shooting the ball well enough, as they have this year, that they can make it a situation where they can be competitive. And you look at the teams that they've beaten.
Their best win is Vanderbilt, and
yeah.
It's unfortunate in the conference they play, and it is what it is. But it also becomes you didn't have a great non-conference. That's fine. But they probably should have better. But you just 47th ranked Vanderbilt is the best win you have, and then you're playing a bunch of top 200 teams.
They beat Kansas State. I mean, I guess my point is not to denigrate what they've accomplished, because look, I think 24-3 in any school is a great accomplishment.
Right.
Drake is, probably one of the 2 or 3 best jobs in the Missouri Valley. Darian DeVries was there for the last 6 years, made the tournament 3 times. He's at West Virginia now. Might be the odds-on favorite to get the Iowa job if Fran McCaffrey gets fired, which I think he's going to. But I will also agree with you that when you look down the list of the games that they've won, there's not a lot there that translates up to the next level. I don't think that, like, the fact that he was able to bring in, like, here's how I would approach this. The players that Curt Cignetti brought from James Madison were bona fide great players that had developed into great players. I mean, whether it's Aiden Fisher or D'Angelo Pons or Mikhail Kamara or Elijah Surratt, right. Like we've seen now they worked at the Big Ten level. it's a bit different with D2 guys coming up. You occasionally get a D2 guy who can compete, but it's just a different physicality, and it's harder to hide people, or it's harder to scheme specifically for advantages at the highest levels of college basketball. And look, IU, one of the big problems IU's had is they haven't been able to recruit at the same levels as the teams that are besting them in the Big Ten or nationally. It's hard to see Ben McCollum being able to come in with no recruiting base outside of like northern Missouri and Iowa and the St. Louis area, because that's where most of his players are from, and being able to get something off the ground quickly. Does his coaching style work at this level? I mean, we've seen different variations, not necessarily the particular like X's and O's. Tony Adrania would be better to talk about with that. But we've seen that tempo and the emphasis on metrics work. I do like that about McCollum, but with a program in the state that IU's in right now, where they have to get this right, they have to re-elevate themselves into the top 20 of programs across the country, this is a really risky strategy. If you're like, you know what, we struck gold once, let's strike gold again by hiring a guy that, you know, is somewhat off the radar but is making noise at a level below. I just don't think that it makes a lot of sense for IU, given the other candidates that are out there. And honestly, as much as we trash the Brownell idea as a hire, at least Brad Brownell has had some success in a power conference.
That's fair. Yeah.
It's a dice roll I just don't think you can afford to make if you're IU. I mean, this is the type of hire that an Iowa or a Minnesota or somebody like that, who's clearly a tier below the ceiling that IU has as a program, can afford to make, and you can afford to take that swing, and if it doesn't work, no big deal. I just don't know if Indiana's in the position right now where they can even afford to think about this, because to go from Northwest Missouri State to IU in a 2-year span just does not seem like a logical progression for me.
I agree. I'd be very nervous. All I'm saying is I think Cignetti provides Dolson the cover to do it if he wants to. If you sit down with him and you're like, this guy checks all the boxes that Cignetti checked for me.
Yeah.
But I think in any other time, it would be too risky to even discuss. I just think that given the backdrop of us sliding a little bit and then just having the exact same analogy on the football side, you could make it. Yeah. I'm with you on all of the concerns, and it would be a risky hire, and it would. If you're Dolson, you're spending all your capital. Like you've built up a ton of capital, you have it all, and any of the other hires we talked about, you get Drew or whatever, like you're probably still going to be good if it doesn't work out. You do this and it doesn't work, you could be gone. Even you lose all of your Cignetti powder. Well,
and that's the last piece that I think is worth bringing up, which is that we talked before about how hard it would be to sell Brad Brownell to the fan base. There's a small core of hardcore people on the message boards who think that Ben McCollum is the ultimate answer, and then you got 99% of IU fans who would be like, what the hell did we just do?
Yeah, I just read an article about Stevens. Like, Brad Brownell coaching the Heat? Like, who is this guy? Yeah, it'd be a jarring wake up for most IU fans.
And look, he may end up being a tremendous Division I coach, maybe, but I think, you know, given where Indiana's at, even Bob Knight, like I've heard people make that comparison. It's like Bob Knight coached at Army for 7 years,
100 wins,
100
right?
wins, like made NIT Final Fours at Army, which was insanely hard to do, given that Bob Knight couldn't have any players over the height of 6'6" because of military regulations at the time. Right. Like, so,
and they had to give up 4 years of their life afterwards.
Right? Yeah, you know. So I mean, it is a completely different argument, and it again, it is no takeaway from the success he had at the D2 level, but it just doesn't seem like a logical hire for IU to even be considering at this point.
Yeah, and there's no ties to. Again, I don't really want ties to Indiana, but it would be different if he was from Terre Haute or what was it? Yeah, something
like Iowa State, Kansas State. Like this is exactly the type of coach that they would hire. Even Nebraska. Like if Fred Hoiberg moved on, like I could see them being like, this guy's from the area. Let's give him a shot. It's just not the same thing here. So.
Yeah, just looking at Knight's record at Army. And so Tree's 102-50. He had 220-win seasons, made it to the NIT 4 times.
I mean, I actually think we've gotten to the point where Bob Knight is underrated as a coach. Like so much of what he did has been overshadowed by the things that happened off the court, or in the chair throw case, on the court. By the way, did you realize that this is the 40th anniversary of the chair throw?
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was because it was late February in 1985. So there you go.
Okay.
This is where the gif of young Matt Damon turning into the old actor that's playing him in Saving Private Ryan happens for half the audience.
Right. Or like we're closer to that, like we're farther away from that than like that was to World War II or something.
No,
like,
it is. No, we're farther away from the chair throw than the chair throw was from the end of World War II.
That's
anyway. Final thoughts. We're going to do more of these, folks. We wanted to dive in.
We need the number.
Oh, my number on this one, 15.
Yeah, I'd be higher. I would just be. It would have to be in Dolson we trust, but I would give it in the 30s. But if we started 6-0, I would be in the 40s, and then if we're 8-0, I'd be in the 70s. Like it would scale, and I would go back and erase them. I'd get the Saudis to steal our podcast again and erase it. Like, I 90 higher again.
It was the Egyptians, not the Saudis. Come on, no, it's fine. Let's give credit where it's due. They tried to knock us off the air twice.
So. Fair and square, yeah.
No, yeah. So I would be very unenthused by this.
Again, it would just feel like. I couldn't imagine that's the first option. I can't imagine Dolson goes into this.
I can't imagine it's the fifth option.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. Any final thoughts before we wrap this one up?
No, I'm like you. I was always a little bit Scott Drew hesitant. I'm going through this process has made me much higher on the Scott Drew hiring and looking at that. And it's pretty amazing what he did at Baylor. So I would say of the ones we've done so far, he's the one that I am the most interested in. And I'm looking forward to more of these because we have the time, man. It's gonna be a while.
Well, that's why we wanted to do these in chunks, and obviously we got a bunch of candidates we can talk about, including some that may be off the table, but we'll talk about them anyway. But we'll have more of these coming up. We'll do another one next week where we'll tackle 3 or 4 more. If you've got questions on this, you can ask us on Substack, or you can ask us via the socials elsewhere. YouTube, we'll take questions there. We also take questions off of Twitter, obviously. So hopefully this was worthwhile and hopefully helps you all as we navigate through another IU basketball coaching search. We'll see where we land. Scott, as always, a pleasure. I'm Galen. This is CrimsonCast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the bison. Stay warm out there, folks. So long, everybody.